Langkawi is a small island and archipelago about 30 kilometres off the west coast of Malaysia. The steep terrain and many hidden coves meant that Langkawi was historically a haven for pirates. Now, however, the beautiful sandy beaches are a tourist paradise, and the forested mountains that form the centre of the islands are home to wildlife in a truly awe-inspiring array of shapes and colours. However, one of the species observed on the island has a staggering array of adaptations allowing it to survive in challenging environments, and therefore is among the most fascinating. Meet the mudskipper. Growing up to 30 centimetres long and largely a brownish-green colour, these are, at initial appearance, a quite unassuming fish. And physiologically, their most immediately obvious deviation from the typical fish body plan is that the mudskipper's eyes protrude from the top of its head, as well as their pectoral fins, which are much further forward along their body than is typically the case. These fins are actually jointed and function more like the limbs of a terrestrial species rather than the fins of a fish, and allow them to crawl from place to place, or indeed allowing the mudskipper to actively skip across muddy surfaces, hence their common name. As their name and general adaptation suggest, mudskippers live in intertidal habitats and exhibit several other unique adaptations to this environment that are not found in most intertidal fish. They burrow instead of the more typical behaviour of hiding in pools or under wet seaweed, and even have the ability to breathe air, either through their skin or through the lining of their mouth and throat, although they are only able to do this when wet. If they dry out, they are at risk of suffocation. As can be seen throughout these clips, the male mudskippers are aggressively territorial, defending both their rights to feed in a given area and indeed their home burrows, the quality of which is vital to both the individual's continued survival and their ability to attract a mate. But not all mudskipper courtships are successful, and here one of the females can clearly be seen indicating her lack of interest in the male attempting to chase her across the mudflats. Unfortunately, as impressive as it is to see how well the mudskippers have adapted to their environment, it wasn't long before we saw our first invasive species on Langkawi, once again the red-eared slider, aka the most invasive turtle, which, as always, has been released or, perhaps generously, escaped from the pet trade. And in keeping with the theme of generally descriptive but frankly awful naming, they are called red-eared sliders for the red stripe around where their ears should be, and their tendency to slide off rocks into water. But as interesting as the sliders and their invasive presence is, it is the native species that we are predominantly interested in on Langkawi. And one of the more striking terrestrial species, at least, is the so-called common butterfly lizard, which, whilst fairly ubiquitous near where we were staying, was nevertheless quite a striking sight to us visitors from Europe. These relatives of the agama have a particularly widespread range, with some species extending as far north as the Ryukyu Islands, although we did not observe them there. The species are particularly notable for their ability to flare the brightly coloured patches along their sides. This appears to be for display rather than in any way assisting flight or gliding, as is occasionally seen in other such species. Butterfly lizards are omnivorous, eating everything from insects, fruits, vegetables, and in areas where their environment overlaps with the sea, they will also eat crabs and other crustaceans. Of the 10 recognised species of butterfly lizard, 6, including the common butterfly lizard, are able to reproduce sexually, which therefore means, astonishingly, 4 species are not only able, but exclusively reproduce asexually. The first major mammal spot we made on Langkawi, we actually first mistook for yet another invasive species, to wit the eastern grey squirrel, which are commonly seen in Europe, where indeed they are also invasive. However, it very quickly became obvious that these squirrels are in fact not eastern greys, and are in fact something entirely different, the grey-bellied squirrel, which again comes under the descriptive but not overly flattering names given to species. The upper parts of the body are generally an olive-brown colour, and some individuals may have reddish flanks or a black tip to the tail, with tendency towards these traits varying between the 6 subspecies. During the dry season though, the upper side of the grey-bellied squirrel tends towards an orange-brown, so the species has another name, occasionally the golden-backed squirrel, which, again, descriptive but at least a little more flattering than simply grey-bellied. The species is generally widespread across Peninsular Malaysia, Thailand, southern Myanmar, even southern China, and there have been reports of the species in western Laos, and much like the common butterfly lizard, the species has also been introduced to the Ryukyu Islands in Japan. Other than this, the species is not extensively studied. It is omnivorous and commonly spotted around areas disturbed by human habitation, including parks and indeed house gardens. They're also not particularly shy around humans, showing no particular tendency to run away from them, and they seem to be reasonably social with other members of their own species, although this may be a family unit rather than unrelated individuals. When they do find something notably offensive, however, their vocalizations are particularly loud considering their body size, and they appear to have an impressive range of vocalizations they can make. The next mammal we spotted on Langkawi is most assuredly not one that may be mistaken for the eastern grey squirrel, although, to be frank, we did initially misidentify it as a monkey, and thus we were introduced to the black giant squirrel, which, without a shadow of a doubt, lives up to the name. With a total body length of about 80 centimetres, of which the tail is slightly more than half, and weighing up to 1.25 kilograms, these truly are giant squirrels. And they are among the largest squirrels in the world, with the notable exception of the Condorensis subspecies in Vietnam, which only measure slightly over 60 centimetres from nose to tail. Although currently listed as having 10 subspecies, the black giant squirrel is currently being investigated to determine whether it is actually several similar species, rather than one single species with several regional variations. And indeed, the Langkawi subspecies has unusually dark underparts compared to the rest of them. Unlike the grey-bellied squirrel we've already seen, the black giant squirrel tends to be solitary and only very rarely leaves the safety of the canopy. The black giant squirrel tends to avoid areas disturbed by human habitation, preferring wild forest instead, which makes the presence of this individual in a park on the waterfront of Kuah on eastern Langkawi particularly notable. While this part of the island is not as heavily developed as some of the western reaches, the forest around Kuah is nevertheless very broken, and the avenues of trees leading into the settlement, and certainly right the way across it to the parks, do not initially appear to support enough trees that one of these squirrels would venture all the way through in order to find foraging grounds. Although, as you will see in a later episode, The black giant squirrel is far from unique in having crossed the boundary of human habitation in order to find somewhere to reside.